Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, let us drift back into the world of early America. Not the great battles, nor the fiery speeches of revolution, but the quiet, ordinary lives of men, women, and children who built their days from dawn until dusk. In this gentle journey, we will explore what life was like in the colonial period of North America from the 1600s through the mid-1700s, when the colonies were still fragile, raw, and uncertain, yet full of daily rhythms that shaped the future. We will not focus on heroes or kings tonight, but instead on the simplest questions. How did they eat? How did they sleep? What did they wear? What did children do for fun? These details, quiet and unhurried, will guide us like the soft flicker of a candle. Chapter 1. The Colonial Home. When we think of colonial America, our minds often rush to visions of tall ships on the harbor, stern-faced men in tricorn hats, or bustling town squares. But for most people, life was not lived in the public stage of history. It was lived quietly, in small wooden homes, in the steady rhythm of family life. And so, before we wander into the wider world of the colonies, let us first step inside a home, the true center of existence for nearly every man, woman, and child. The homes of colonial settlers varied, but most were built from the same simple materials: wood from the forests, mud gathered from the earth, stone pulled from nearby fields. In New England, where winters cut deep and snow lay heavy, the houses were often drafty cabins, roughly built at first, with wide gaps in the boards that let the wind whistle through. The earliest dwellings were not grand. They were survival shelters. A settler family arriving with little more than tools, blankets, and hope had to raise walls quickly before the cold set in. And so a cabin might stand, rough-hewn logs notched together, a mud and stick chimney at one end, smoke curling out into the gray sky. Inside, space was limited. The typical family lived in a single room, sometimes with a loft above for sleeping. Furniture was handmade, plain, sturdy, and practical. A table of rough planks might stand in the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched stools or benches. A single chest might hold clothing, papers, or valuables. Chairs were rare luxuries, often reserved for the father or the head of the household. Children sat on stools or simply stood nearby. A cupboard or shelf might hold the family's few dishes, perhaps pewter plates or wooden bowls. Possessions were few, but each one carried meaning. A heavy iron pot passed down from grandparents. A Bible wrapped in cloth to protect it from the soot of the hearth. A blanket that had been spun, woven and dyed by hand. The heart of the home was always the fireplace. In those times, it was more than a source of warmth. It was the stove, the light, and the gathering place of the family. The fireplace dominated the main room, often taking up an entire wall. Its wide stone hearth swallowed whole logs, sometimes more than a man could lift. From the iron hook or crane swung pots of stew or porridge, bread baked in the coals, meat roasted on spits, and the smoky air filled every corner of the house. On winter nights, the smoke clung to clothes, blankets, even hair, until it became the familiar scent of life itself. Families gathered close to the fire, not only for heat, but for comfort. It was there that stories were told, prayers were spoken, and the long evenings of winter stretched into silence. The house was not silent, however. At night, new sounds rose up. The creaking beams, made from green wood that shifted and groaned as it dried. The howling wind pushing through shutters that never quite shut tight. Outside, the scratch of animals, perhaps a stray dog, or raccoons, or simply branches tapping against the wall. In New England especially, winter nights could feel endless. The cold seeped in through every gap, despite blankets and layers of wool. Yet the sound of the fire's crackle and the low breathing of family members gave reassurance that life carried on, even in the dark. Sleeping arrangements were far from the privacy we know today. Beds were precious and often shared. Children might sleep 2 or 3 to a straw mattress, their bodies pressed together for warmth. Mattresses themselves were sacks stuffed with straw, corn husks, or feathers if a family could afford them. Over time, the straw grew flat, and the sack needed fluffing with a stick. Sheets were coarse linen, and blankets were often itchy wool, heavy upon the body but vital against the cold. Parents and infants might share a bed, sometimes with a trundle bed, a smaller mattress on wheels pulled out from beneath for younger children. In lofts, children slept shoulder to shoulder, the low rafters just above their heads, the smell of smoke rising into the beams. Privacy was unknown, but family closeness was a constant. The day began early in a colonial home. Long before the sun rose, the first sounds stirred the household awake. In farming villages, the rooster's crow was the natural alarm clock, joined by the lowing of cows waiting to be milked. In towns, church bells sometimes rang at dawn, marking the rhythm of daily life. Chores began before breakfast, fetching water from a well or stream, splitting firewood, tending the animals, sweeping the hearth. Every pair of hands had work to do. Even the youngest children carried small responsibilities, gathering eggs, feeding chickens, carrying kindling. For the mother, mornings meant stoking the fire back to life, for it was rarely allowed to go out completely. A pot of porridge might be reheated, bread broken and shared, milk poured if the cow had been generous. Fathers and sons might live for fields, apprenticeships, or workshops. Daughters and mothers would turn to spinning, sewing, or preparing the day's meals. Life revolved around the home, but the home itself was never simply a shelter. It was the foundation of family identity, a symbol of survival, and the place where each day's story began and ended. If you imagine yourself walking into such a house, you would first notice its dimness. Candles were costly, so daylight was precious. Small windows, covered with oiled paper or tiny panes of glass, admitted little light. Shadows clung to corners, and the air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and drying herbs. The floor might be bare earth, packed firm by many feet, or wooden planks smoothed by time. Above, rafters displayed hanging bundles of onions, corn, or tobacco, leaves the ceiling a kind of storage place. The family cat might sit curled near the fire, while chickens in poorer households sometimes wandered in and out. This was the rhythm of colonial homes, Sturdy, smoky, filled with work, yet bound by warmth and closeness. It was not comfort as we understand it today, but it was security. To have a roof, a hearth, and a place for your family to rest was to have the essentials of life. Within those four walls, history was not written in battles or proclamations, but in the quiet persistence of ordinary people.
Chapter 2. Food and Farming Life. If the home was the heart of colonial life, food was its constant rhythm. Every day, from the first stirring of dawn until the dark of night, the work of finding, preparing, and preserving food shaped the lives of families. It was not simply a matter of eating to satisfy hunger. Food meant survival, comfort, and order in a world where the difference between plenty and scarcity was often a thin line, drawn by the seasons and the land itself. In the colonies, corn was more than a crop. It was a lifeline. From the very first settlements, corn proved to be the grain that could endure the rough climate and uncertain soils of North America. Unlike wheat, which often failed in thin or rocky ground, corn grew tall and strong, yielding a dependable harvest. Families ground it into meal for porridge, baked it into cornbread, and boiled it into thick stews. Children grew up on corn mush, often flavored with little more than milk or a pinch of salt. In lean months, when pantries ran bare, cornmeal was the food that carried families through. Alongside it grew beans, climbing the tall stalks of corn in the traditional Three Sisters planting, and pumpkins sprawling across the earth, their orange bodies ripening in the autumn sun. These staples became the foundation of the colonial diet. Fresh produce followed the rhythm of the seasons. In summer, gardens produced peas, onions, carrots, and greens. In autumn, apples filled barrels, to be dried, pressed into cider, or stored for winter. Berries were gathered from the woods. Blackberries, blueberries, wild strawberries, their sweetness a rare delight in a world without refined sugar. Herbs, too, found their place in kitchen gardens. Sage, thyme, and parsley, drying in bundles near the hearth, ready to flavor stews through the long winter. Imported luxuries were known, but rare. Sugar, tea, and spices came across the Atlantic, but at high cost. A small cone of sugar might be carefully stored in a cupboard, chipped into tiny pieces for special occasions. Tea, when available, was steeped sparingly, leaves reused to stretch their worth. Spices, such as cinnamon or nutmeg, were treasures, often saved for festive days or for guests. For most families, flavor was simple, drawn from what the earth provided. Salt, too, was precious, not only for taste but for preserving meat and fish. Bread, the staple of European diets, was not always easy to produce in the colonies. Wheat was difficult to grow in rocky soils, and flour often had to be imported. For many families, bread was made with a mixture of cornmeal and rye, baked in outdoor clay ovens or hearths. These ovens were heated with blazing fires, then swept clean of embers before dough was slid inside. The smell of baking bread, drifting through the air, was a comfort to neighbors as well as family. Butter, too, was made by hand. Cream was poured into wooden churns, and with steady, rhythmic effort, it was beaten until the butter fat separated. The work was long, but the result, golden butter spread on fresh bread, was one of life's quiet pleasures. Farming itself demanded long hours, from the breaking of dawn until darkness. In spring, plows cut furrows into fields, drawn by oxen or horses if a family was fortunate enough to own them. Seeds were planted by hand, each row tended with care. In summer, weeds were pulled, crops hoed, and fences mended. Autumn brought the harvest, a time of both relief and urgency. Corn was cut and stacked, pumpkins gathered, beans dried for winter use. Every hand was needed, men, women, and children alike. Farming was not a profession for some. It was the reality for nearly everyone. The soil dictated survival. Animals, too, were central to farm life, Cows provided milk, which was turned into butter and cheese. Chickens laid eggs, though not always reliably in the cold months. Pigs were kept for meat, their lard used in cooking and candle making. Sheep gave wool, while oxen provided the heavy strength needed for plowing. Each animal was a resource, cared for and valued, but also destined for use. Nothing was wasted. Hides became leather, bones turned into tools, fat rendered into soap. Preserving food was as important as growing it. Winters in the colonies could be long and harsh, and without modern refrigeration, families had to be clever in storing supplies. Meat was salted or smoked, hung in cool cellars to last until spring. Fruits were dried, vegetables pickled, and cider sealed in barrels. Root cellars, dug beneath houses or barns, held potatoes, turnips, and carrots in the cold earth. The success of a family's preparations could mean the difference between comfort and hunger when snow covered the ground. Hunger was never far from memory. Scarcity shaped attitudes toward food. A poor harvest meant lean months when meals grew smaller and simpler. Bread was stretched with whatever grains could be found. Porridge became thinner, meat rarer. Families spoke often of plenty and want, marking the years not by abundance but by whether the harvest had been kind. Even in years of bounty, the shadow of hunger remained, a reminder that nature could not always be trusted. The seasonal rhythm guided everything. Planting in the spring, tending in the summer, harvesting in the autumn, enduring in the winter. Life followed this pattern year after year, steady and unchanging. Meals reflected this cycle, with fresh produce in warm months, preserved foods in the cold. There was comfort in the repetition and also challenge. It taught patience, endurance, and the quiet acceptance of limits. And yet, despite the hardships, food was also a source of joy. A warm loaf of bread, a bowl of fresh berries, a roasted chicken on a feast day. These moments brought comfort and even celebration. Neighbors shared meals at barn raisings, harvest festivals, or simple visits. A mug of cider by the fire, a slice of pie flavored with apples and spice, such tastes reminded families that life held sweetness, even in a world of labor. Food, then, was more than nourishment. It was the measure of the seasons, the fruit of labor, the anchor of family life. It brought people together, carried them through hunger, and marked the quiet rhythm of existence in the colonial world.
Chapter 3: Clothing and Appearance. When we think of history, we often imagine great battles, or the passing of laws, or the founding of towns. But to the people who lived through those times, one of the most constant concerns was something far quieter: what to wear. Clothing in colonial America was not a matter of fashion as we know it today. It was a matter of necessity, of labor, of patience, and often of scarcity. Most garments were made at home from fibers grown, spun, and woven by hand. Wool and linen were the staples of the colonial wardrobe. Linen came from flax, a plant grown in fields, its stems soaked, pounded, and combed into fibers before being spun into thread. Wool, shorn from sheep, was washed, carded, spun, and woven into heavy cloth. These fabrics were plain, often coarse to the touch, but durable. Cotton was rare and costly in the northern colonies, though more available in the south. Silks and fine fabrics did exist, but only for the wealthy, who could afford imports. Color was modest. Dyes were drawn from natural sources. Walnut shells for deep browns, indigo for blue, onion skins for yellow, madder root for red. The colors were soft, often fading with time, never bright or brilliant like modern fabrics. A colonial village, seen with modern eyes, would look muted shades of gray, brown, cream, and dull blue rather than the rainbow hues we expect today. The very dullness of the colors reflected the hard work behind them. For each dye required effort and careful preparation. Shoes were scarce. A well-made pair of leather stitched by a cobbler was valuable and often handed down from one family member to another. Children, growing fast, sometimes went without shoes in warmer months, running barefoot across fields and roads. Winter, however, demanded protection, and many families struggled to provide boots or sturdy footwear for every member. A child might inherit shoes that were far too large, stuffed with wool or straw to make them fit. For the poor, shoes were sometimes absent entirely, and bare feet were a common sight. Children were dressed as miniature adults. There were no playful children's fashions, no bright patterns reserved for youth. Instead, boys wore breeches or long shirts, and girls wore gowns, aprons, and caps. Stiff collars and heavy fabrics restricted movement, even in play. Caps were common for both boys and girls, linen caps tied under the chin, or simple cloth coifs covering the head. Infants, too, were tightly swaddled, their movements bound in the belief that it promoted proper growth. Childhood was not marked by distinct clothing, but by smaller versions of what their parents wore. The process of creating a garment was long and slow. After fibers were grown, shorn, or gathered, they had to be spun into thread on a wheel. Then came the weaving. Each thread passed carefully across the loom. Finally, the cloth was cut and stitched into garments by hand, every seam sewn with needle and thread. Clothing was not made lightly, nor discarded quickly. A single garment might be patched and repatched, worn by one sibling, and then passed to another, serving for years before it was finally cut down into rags. Even those rags found new life, used for cleaning, bandages, or stuffing. Nothing was wasted. Because clothing required such labor, most families owned only a handful of outfits. Everyday clothes were plain, durable, and meant for work. Aprons protected gowns, while leather breeches resisted wear in the fields. Clothes grew soiled quickly, for washing was itself an arduous task done by hand in cold water with lye soap. Laundry days were long and exhausting, and so garments were worn until truly in need of cleaning. Yet, despite the plainness of everyday attire, there was always a distinction between weekday and Sunday best. Even poor families tried to keep one set of clothing aside, carefully mended, for Sundays and holy days. A clean linen collar, a polished buckle, a freshly pressed gown, these small signs of care were expressions of respect for the Sabbath and for community gatherings. A man's best coat or a woman's best bonnet might be worn only a handful of times each year, yet they carried pride and dignity far beyond their simple fabric. Clothing also revealed status within the community. The wealthy displayed finer materials, imported silks, lace, or brightly dyed fabrics. A merchant might wear a waistcoat with brass buttons, while a prosperous landowner's wife might adorn herself with a gown of patterned calico or a silk kerchief. In contrast, the laborer's clothes were rough and homespun, patched and faded. Even the smallest details, a shoe buckle, a hat, a ribbon signaled one's place in society. Colonial laws sometimes even restricted clothing, forbidding common folk from wearing certain fabrics or adornments reserved for the elite. Appearance was not just personal, it was social, carrying messages understood by all. Head coverings were nearly universal. Men wore hats of felt or straw, protecting against sun and weather. Women wore linen caps indoors and wide-brimmed bonnets outdoors. Hair was rarely shown uncovered, for both practicality and modesty. In winter, woolen mittens, cloaks, and shawls were layered for warmth, though never quite enough to keep out the deepest cold. Despite the scarcity, clothing carried meaning far beyond necessity. A well-mended garment spoke of care and diligence. A bright ribbon in a girl's cap might be a treasured gift, carefully saved. A pair of sturdy boots could symbolize prosperity. Clothes were not just coverings. They were quiet markers of identity, of belonging, of one's place in the fabric of colonial life. And so, while fashion was never fast in the colonies and styles changed little across decades, clothing wove its own story. A story of labor, of simplicity, of community, and of endurance. In every stitch, in every patch, in every faded color, the life of the colonies could be read plain, practical, and enduring, just like the people who wore them. Chapter 4: Work and Occupations. Life in colonial America was built upon work. Every sunrise called people to labor, and every sunset signaled its end. There was little separation between living and working, for to live was to work, and to work was to live. In a world without machines, every task depended upon human hands and the strength of animals. The rhythm of life was dictated not by clocks, but by daylight, the turning of seasons, and the needs of the household. For men, work was often tied to the land. Farming remained the most common occupation, for the colonies were, above all, agrarian. A farmer rose before the sun, fed his animals, and walked his fields with tools in hand. He plowed the soil, sowed seeds, pulled weeds, and harvested crops in their season. His tasks were endless, for land always demanded care. A farmer did not work only in spring and autumn. He worked year-round, mending fences in winter, cutting timber, repairing tools, and tending livestock. His reward was not wealth, but the simple promise of food and survival. Other men became tradesmen, practicing crafts essential to village life. The blacksmith, with his hammer and anvil, shaped iron into nails, hinges, horseshoes, and tools. His forge glowed like a second hearth for the community, and the steady ring of his hammer was a familiar sound. The cooper built barrels, without which grain, cider, and salted meat could not be stored or shipped. The carpenter shaped wood into furniture, wagons, or beams for new homes. Each trade required years of learning, but each filled needs upon which others relied. Along the coasts, many men took to the sea. Sailors carried goods between colonies or across the Atlantic. Fishermen hauled cod and mackerel from the northern waters, their catches dried and salted for market. Shipbuilders labored in yards, constructing vessels of oak and pine, their skeletons rising along the shoreline like the bones of great creatures. The sea was dangerous, yet it provided both livelihood and connection, binding the colonies to one another and to the wider world. For women, work was just as constant, though centered within and around the home. Spinning, Weaving and sewing were daily tasks, for clothing had to be made, mended, and remade again. Women prepared meals from raw ingredients, grinding grain, churning butter, and boiling stews at the hearth. Soap had to be made, a slow process of rendering fat and mixing lye. Candles were dipped, one after another, until enough light could be saved for dark winter nights. Washing clothes meant hauling water, scrubbing with harsh soap, and wringing garments by hand. The work never ended. Every task a woman completed was essential, and every day brought more of the same. Yet women's labor extended beyond the home. Many helped in fields during planting or harvest, or tended gardens and animals. They brewed beer, baked bread, and kept household accounts. In towns, some women became midwives, shopkeepers, or tavern keepers. But even in these roles, society often expected them to maintain their domestic duties as well. The weight of responsibility was heavy, yet it was carried with quiet endurance, for work was not simply duty, it was survival. Children, too, were workers from an early age. By the time a child was 5 or 6, small chores filled their days. Boys fetched water, gathered firewood, and scared birds from crops. Girls helped with spinning, fed chickens, or cared for younger siblings. As children grew, their duties grew with them. A boy of 10 might guide a plow team, while a girl of the same age might spend hours at the loom. Play existed, but it was often woven between tasks or confined to the rare moments of rest. Childhood, as we know it today, was short. Apprenticeships were another path for children, especially boys. Around the age of 12 or 14, a boy might be sent to live with a master craftsman, learning a trade such as blacksmithing, carpentry, or tailoring. For years, he worked under strict guidance, performing menial tasks while slowly acquiring skill. In return, the master provided food, shelter, and training. Only after many years could the apprentice become a journeyman, and eventually, with luck and effort, a master himself. This system bound trades together and ensured that knowledge passed steadily from one generation to the next. Not all work in the colonies was free. Enslaved labor formed a harsh and undeniable part of daily life, particularly in the southern colonies. Men, women, and children who were enslaved were forced to labor in fields of tobacco, rice, and indigo, or within homes as cooks, servants, and caretakers. Their work was not chosen, and their time was not their own. From sunrise until sunset, they toiled under the watch of overseers, their labor enriching others while granting them no reward. Even in the North, where slavery was less widespread, enslaved people and indentured servants carried burdensome tasks chopping wood, cleaning, and working in workshops. Their contributions built much of colonial society, though their lives were marked by hardship and lack of freedom. Time itself was a precious resource. Without clocks in every home, the sun and the seasons guided work. At dawn, tasks began. At dusk, they ended. The day was not measured in minutes, but in chores completed. A row plowed, a loaf baked, a fence mended. In summer, the work stretched long into the evening light. In winter, darkness arrived quickly, and families gathered by firelight to finish what could be done indoors. Unlike today, where machines carry much of the burden, every hour of daylight was filled with labor, and every season brought its own demands. Despite the toil, work gave life structure and meaning. To labor was to contribute, to ensure survival, to provide for family and community. It forged bonds, for neighbors often helped one another with large tasks, raising barns, harvesting crops, or building roads. It also created identity. A man was known by his trade: farmer, blacksmith, sailor, and a woman by her household skills. Even children carried reputations for their diligence, or lack thereof. And so, from dawn to dusk, the colonies hummed with work. Hammers rang in forges, axes split wood in forests, looms clattered in homes, and plows carved furrows into fields. The sound of labor was the sound of life itself. And when night finally came, and candles burned low, families rested not in leisure, but in preparation for the work that would greet them again with the rising sun. Chapter 5: Faith, Education, and Community Life. Beyond the walls of the home and the rhythm of daily work, colonial life was shaped by something larger: the bonds of faith, the pursuit of knowledge, and the shared life of the community. To the people of the colonies, faith was not merely belief, education was not merely schooling, and community was not merely neighbors. Each was woven into the fabric of existence, guiding thoughts, shaping habits, and providing meaning in a world that could often feel uncertain and harsh. Faith, above all, stood at the center of life. For many settlers, religion was the very reason they had crossed the ocean, seeking freedom to worship in their own way. In New England, Puritans organized towns around their meeting houses, where every Sunday the entire community gathered. The meeting house was plain wooden benches, unadorned walls, and a pulpit at the front, yet it was the heart of the settlement. There, ministers preached long sermons, sometimes lasting 2 or 3 hours. Their words meant to guide both the soul and the society. Attendance was expected and absence was noted. Sunday was a day of rest from labor, but it was not a day of leisure. It was solemn, devoted to prayer, reflection, and scripture. In other colonies, faith took different forms. Quakers in Pennsylvania gathered in silence, waiting until someone felt moved to speak. Anglicans in Virginia held services modeled after the Church of England, with more ceremony and structure. Catholics, though fewer in number, maintained their traditions in Maryland. Despite differences, nearly all colonists shared the conviction that religion was essential, not just for the individual, but for the order of the community. Laws often reflected this belief, with regulations about church attendance, moral conduct, and the observance of holy days. Faith was not separate from daily life, it was its foundation. Education, too, was closely tied to faith. In many places, the purpose of schooling was first and foremost to teach children to read the Bible. In New England, one-room schoolhouses appeared early, supported by towns that valued literacy. A child might learn to read from a hornbook, a small wooden paddle with a sheet of paper attached, covered by thin transparent horn. On it were the alphabet, syllables, and the Lord's Prayer. From this simple tool, children began their lessons. Books were scarce, often limited to the Bible, an almanac, and perhaps a primer. Writing was taught with quill pens, ink made from soot or berries, and scraps of paper. Arithmetic, too, was introduced, for trade and commerce required numbers as much as words. But schooling was not universal. Many children, especially in rural areas, had little time for lessons. Their labor needed on farms or in homes. Some learned at home, taught by parents in the evenings. Others grew to adulthood with little literacy at all, relying instead on memory, storytelling, and practical skill. Higher education was rare, reserved for a small few. Harvard College, founded in 1636, was one of the earliest institutions meant to train ministers. Other colleges followed, but for most families, the thought of university was distant. Still, the value of learning persisted. Almanacs, filled with weather predictions, moral sayings, and practical advice, were read aloud in homes. Oral tradition carried stories, histories, and wisdom from one generation to the next. Education was not only found in schoolrooms, it was found in the patterns of daily life. Community life was perhaps the strongest thread of all. Colonists lived not in isolation, but in tightly bound groups where every person was known and every family was woven into the whole. Cooperation was essential. Neighbors came together for barn raisings, where heavy timbers were lifted by many hands. Quilting bees gathered women, who stitched while exchanging stories. Men met at militia musters, training together to defend the settlement if needed. In times of harvest, neighbors helped one another bring in crops before weather turned. In times of loss, they gathered to mourn and to comfort. The community was also the place of regulation. Town meetings in New England gave voice to freemen, who voted on local matters and enforced laws. In southern colonies, county courts and parish vestries guided order. Everyone was part of the whole, and reputation mattered deeply. A good name, marked by honesty and diligence, was valued. Gossip, too, had power, for in small communities, words carried weight. Festivals and gatherings broke the monotony of labor. Harvest celebrations brought music, dancing, and shared feasts. Weddings were community events, filling homes and yards with laughter. Even funerals, though solemn, drew neighbors together, affirming bonds of care and support. Taverns, especially in towns, became centers of news and conversation, where men debated politics, exchanged ideas, or simply shared stories by candlelight. And through it all, time moved in cycles marked by faith, learning, and fellowship. Sundays slowed the pace of life. School days prepared the young for their roles. Community events reminded each person that they were part of something larger than themselves. These rhythms gave shape to the years, creating a sense of order in a world that could often feel fragile. Faith gave purpose, education gave knowledge, community gave belonging. Together, they sustained colonial families, binding them not only to one another, but to the generations who would follow. And in their quiet way, they left a legacy that echoed far beyond the walls of the colonies, shaping the identity of a new people. Chapter 6. Hardships and Fears. Life in colonial America was not only marked by community, faith, and daily work. Beneath the steady rhythm of farming and family, there ran a constant undercurrent of hardship and worry. For the people of the colonies, survival was never guaranteed. Each season carried its own trials, and each day brought challenges that tested endurance, courage, and faith. The winters in New England were among the greatest hardships. Cabins were drafty, with thin walls of wood and clay that did little to keep out the biting wind. Fireplaces struggled to warm large rooms, and smoke often filled the air. Families huddled close at night, sharing beds and blankets to preserve warmth. Food stores dwindled as the months dragged on. A barrel of salted meat might spoil, or root vegetables might rot in the cellar. Hunger gnawed at households, and in lean years, meals grew smaller, sometimes reduced to nothing more than corn mush or broth stretched thin. Summer, though brighter, brought its own trials. Insects swarmed, crops sometimes failed under drought or storm, and sickness spread more easily in the heat. Colonists feared fevers and plagues, illnesses they did not understand and could not cure. Doctors were few, and their remedies bleeding, purging. Herbal tinctures were uncertain at best. A simple infection, a cut on the hand, or the bite of an animal could turn fatal. Families often endured the loss of children, mothers in childbirth, or fathers in accidents, their grief heavy but borne with quiet resignation. Storms struck suddenly, tearing through fields and toppling trees onto cabins. Fires were feared above all else. A single spark from a hearth could ignite a wooden home, and with buckets as the only defense, entire settlements could burn before help arrived. At night, colonists lay awake listening to the creak of beams in the wind, praying that their roof would hold, their chimney would not spark, their livestock would remain safe. Beyond the home, dangers lingered at the edges of settlements. The forests that surrounded the villages were vast and shadowed. To some, they were places of mystery, filled with unseen creatures, and the constant possibility of becoming lost. Wolves howled in the distance. Bears roamed in search of food. Travelers moving between towns risked not only wild animals but also bandits or accidents on rough, unmarked paths. Conflict also haunted the colonies. Relations with indigenous peoples were complex, sometimes built on trade and fragile peace, but often marked by suspicion and violence. Skirmishes, raids, and wars erupted, leaving families fearful that danger might strike at any time. For those living on the frontier, the threat of attack was never far from mind. For enslaved men, women, and children, hardship was constant. Torn from families and forced into labor without freedom, they bore suffering that went beyond hunger and cold. Days were filled with endless work under harsh command, and nights with the longing for dignity and liberty. Their fears were not only of natural dangers, but of human cruelty, punishments, and the uncertainty of what future awaited their children. Even within the safety of towns, fears took shape in subtler ways. Superstition ran deep. Comets in the sky, eclipses of the sun, or sudden storms were often seen as signs of divine displeasure. Witchcraft, too, lingered in the imagination, with whispers of curses, spells, and the unseen hand of evil. These beliefs, though less tangible than hunger or disease, weighed heavily on minds already burdened by survival. And yet, despite these fears, life continued. Colonists rose with the sun, tended their fields, mended their homes, and gathered with their neighbors. Hardship was endured with patience, often softened by faith and the comfort of community. Each winter passed, each summer returned, each generation bore its struggles, teaching resilience to the next. To live in colonial America was to live with uncertainty, but it was also to live with perseverance, the quiet strength of those who endured hardship and carried on, even when the nights were long, the winds howled outside, and fear pressed against the wooden walls of their homes. Chapter 7: Leisure, Festivities, and Small Joys. For all its struggles, colonial life was not only a tale of hunger and labor. Within the long days of work and worry, people carved out moments of joy, small celebrations that brightened the darkness and gave shape to the passing seasons. These were not luxuries, but necessities of the spirit. They reminded weary families that life was more than toil. It was also song, companionship, and laughter. Leisure, in those days, was rarely idle. When men and women found spare moments, they often turned them into shared pleasures. In the evenings, when chores were finished and the fire glowed in the hearth, families might gather with neighbors. Someone would bring out a fiddle, or perhaps a simple flute carved from wood. A few familiar tunes could fill the smoky air, and voices, rough and untrained, yet full of heart, would rise in song. The music was not polished, but it was enough to lift weary spirits. Festivities marked the rhythm of the year. Harvest time, though grueling, was followed by moments of celebration. When the last sheaves of corn or wheat were gathered in, the community might host a feast. Tables, simple as they were, held what the land provided: roasted meat, baked bread, stewed beans, and the precious sweetness of apples or pumpkins. Neighbors gathered to share in the bounty, for food was never taken for granted. To eat well together was itself a festival. Holidays carried even more meaning. In New England, the Sabbath was strictly observed, but days like Thanksgiving became occasions to pause and give thanks, not only for survival but for fellowship. In other colonies, Christmas and other feasts were celebrated with dances, games, and candlelit gatherings. Children looked forward to these days with excitement, knowing they might taste treats or wear their best clothes. Adults cherished them too, for they were rare respites from routine. Children, though burdened with chores, still found ways to play. A stick and hoop could become a game for hours. Stones could be tossed in a contest, or marbles shaped from clay rolled along the dirt. In winter, frozen ponds invited sliding and laughter, the children's shouts carrying across the cold air. Dolls, simple and carved from scraps of wood or sewn from cloth, were treasured companions. Even with so little, children found joy in their imaginations. Taverns, too, played a role in leisure, especially for men. They were not only places to drink ale, but hubs of conversation, storytelling, and music. Around the fire, Men debated news from distant towns or spoke of voyages across the sea. Stories, true or imagined, grew longer as the night deepened. The tavern was where loneliness eased, where laughter broke the silence of laboring weeks. Women, though their lives brimmed with endless tasks, carved out small joys of their own. Spinning circles or quilting bees were as much social occasions as they were work. Hands moved steadily, but voices carried stories, laughter, and songs. These gatherings built bonds of friendship, turning necessary chores into shared experiences of comfort. Festivities also tied people to the land and to the seasons. Autumn harvest festivals, winter gatherings around the hearth, spring celebrations of planting, and summer dances in open fields all reminded families of the cyclical nature of life. These moments stitched the year together, giving shape to time in ways more joyful than the endless grind of chores. Even in hardship, humor found its way in. Colonists told jokes and riddles, often simple, sometimes teasing. Children laughed at each other's antics, and adults found relief in shared amusement. Laughter softened the edges of hunger, brightened the long winters, and gave courage for the days ahead. At the heart of these joys was togetherness. For people who lived far from the comforts of the old world, companionship was a treasure. They might not have riches, but they had one another. The flicker of firelight on familiar faces, the sound of a fiddle carrying into the night, the warmth of shared food and shared burdens, these were the small joys that made survival meaningful. Colonial life was difficult, but it was not joyless. In the balance of toil and festivity, hardship and laughter, fear and faith, people found reasons to endure. And in those quiet pleasures, the harvest feast, the child's laughter, the song by the hearth, they carried forward a resilience that was not only physical, but deeply human. Chapter 8: The Legacy of Colonial Life. When we look back across the centuries to those early colonial days, it is tempting to see them only as a distant and foreign world. Rough cabins, worn garments, flickering hearths, and endless toil. Yet in many ways, the legacy of colonial life lingers quietly in the foundations of the modern world. The colonists, in their simplicity and their struggles, left behind habits, traditions, and values that still echo today. Their lives, though shaped by scarcity, carried lessons of resilience, community, and resourcefulness. They lived with less, but they cherished what little they had. They endured hardship, but they celebrated moments of joy with all the more fervor. That balance of labor and laughter, of fear and faith became part of the cultural fabric that endured long after their cabins faded into dust. In the architecture of early America, one can still see hints of those vast timber frames and modest farmhouses. Though few original structures remain, the idea of the simple homestead house as both shelter and family hearth continues to shape how we imagine home. The fireplace, once the literal heart of survival, remains a symbol of warmth, comfort, and gathering. Food traditions, too, carry echoes of colonial tables. Cornbread, pumpkin dishes, baked beans, and cider all trace back to those early kitchens. Even the great American Thanksgiving, now celebrated with abundance, has its roots in the humble gratitude of harvest fields. where survival itself was reason enough to give thanks. Clothing, while long since transformed by industry and fashion, still carries the memory of careful handiwork. The patience of spinning, weaving, and mending spoke to a culture that valued longevity, thrift, and care. These values, though dimmed in the modern world, still whisper in the pride of something handmade, something lasting. Perhaps most enduring of all was the sense of community. In a world where survival depended on cooperation, neighbors mattered. Shared work, shared food, shared burdens, these built bonds that went deeper than convenience. Even now, in times of hardship, people instinctively return to those old values, helping one another, leaning on fellowship, finding strength in togetherness. Of course, the colonial legacy is not only one of endurance and virtue. It also carries shadows that cannot be forgotten: the harsh treatment of enslaved people, the displacement of indigenous communities, the deep inequalities written into everyday life. These, too, are part of the story, remind us that the past was not idyllic, but complicated, marked by both resilience and injustice. To remember colonial life fully is to hold both truths at once. Yet even with these complexities, there is something profoundly human in the record of colonial existence. Their days were not so unlike ours, filled with work and worry, but also with laughter, small joys, and quiet hopes for the future. They lived in a fragile world, uncertain and often harsh, yet they built lives of meaning and left behind legacies of courage, persistence, and imagination. And as we let the story settle into silence, it is comforting to think that across the centuries, those ordinary people, farmers, mothers, children, laborers, would not be so different from us after all. They dreamed of warmth on cold nights, of food to ease hunger, of companionship in loneliness. They hoped their children might live better lives. In their longing, in their endurance, we can still see reflections of ourselves. The colonial world has passed into history, but its spirit lingers in the homes we cherish, in the rituals we celebrate, in the resilience we summon when times grow hard. Its legacy is not a grand monument, but a quiet presence woven into daily life. And in remembering it now, we honor not only the struggles but also the small joys, the endurance, and the humanity that carried them through.